For 9 winter weeks, something tall moved through the trees beside my car, from the first switchback to deadfall mile marker 12. That road had already taken my younger brother, Eli, 3 years earlier, and after I cut one trapped creature free in an ice storm before dawn, I stopped calling myself alone. What followed did not make sense in town talk, but it settled into my life as steady as breath. I was 58 then, a night nurse at the Foothill Hospice Clinic off Highway 2, and before that, I was an army medic who learned to work with cold hands and no sleep. Nights had a shape I could trust. I clocked in at 6, checked oxygen lines, checked insulin, turned men and women whose bones had gone thin, wrote my notes in block letters, and kept my coffee in a dented steel thermos Eli had found at a surplus sale years back. I did not rush. I did not linger. I moved room to room and kept people comfortable until dawn. By the 3rd winter after Eli died, routine had become the frame that held me upright. No wife, no children, no one waiting up except my old dog, Scout, and the wood stove in a cedar cabin 22 miles up the mountain. I kept chains hanging by the porch door on iron hooks, scrub tops drying near the stove, and cast iron soup in a pot. I reheated every morning before sleep. I could split kindling by feel in the dark. I could tell by wind against the eaves whether the road would glaze before midnight. The clinic smelled like bleach, hand soap, broth, and warmed plastic tubing. Just before shift change, there was always a brief stillness in the hall, like the building held its breath, while one crew handed the night to the next. On the morning this began, Mara from day shift stood at the nurses' station pulling on her gloves and looked toward the frosted window by the entrance. "Road is icing at the upper curves," she said. "I brought chains," I said. She nodded once and handed me a chart to sign. "Drive slow past Deadfall. County has not salted that stretch." I signed, tucked my pen in my chest pocket, and headed out. The cold met me hard when the door opened. My breath rose white in the parking lot lights. The truck started on the second turn, old engine knocking once before it settled. I set the thermos in the cup holder, turned the heater to low, and eased onto the mountain road with wipers clicking over dry frost. Dawn had not broken yet. The trees were black columns on both sides, tight and tall, and the road climbed into them like a narrow seam. I had driven that route so often I knew each pull-out, each rock face, each guardrail post with bent reflectors. I also knew the place where Eli's logging truck went over. Deadfall Bend came after the second switchback, where runoff crossed the lane and froze thin. 3 years earlier, his rig hit black ice, slid broadside and rolled twice down the embankment, before the cab held on a cedar stump. They called me at the clinic because I was next of kin, and because someone thought a medic brother should hear it, direct. I still remembered the sheriff's voice over the phone, flat and careful. After the funeral, I kept driving that road anyway, not to prove anything. There was no other way home. Scout started warning me before I knew what he was warning me about. He rode in the passenger seat on nights when the weather was bad and his joints ached, muzzle grey and one ear nicked from some old fight long before I got him. Near the first switchback, he would lift his head from the blanket and let out a low growl that stayed in his chest. Not barking, just a steady sound that meant he smelled something moving close. The first time I thought it was elk, the second time I thought bear. By the end of that week, I stopped naming it. I began to feel it before I saw anything. Not fear exactly. Pressure. A sense of company at the edge of the lights where alder and fir stood tight together. The kind of awareness you get in a hospital room when someone wakes before the monitor tone changes. My hands stayed at 10 and 2 on the wheel. I did not speed up. I did not stop. I watched the right shoulder, then the left, and listened to Scout's breath. One morning, just past mile 9, the headlights caught movement running parallel in the trees. Tall. Too tall for a deer at that distance and wrong in the shoulders. It kept pace for maybe 6 seconds, then slipped behind a cluster of trunks and was gone. I drove the rest of the route with my jaw set and my eyes dry and wide, and when I pulled into my cabin, Drive Scout jumped down and stood facing the tree line until I touched his collar. "Inside," I told him. He looked once more into the dark, then followed me in. I slept through most days, but that week sleep came in thin pieces. I would wake near noon and sit at the table with soup and toast, looking at snowmelt dripping from the porch roof. On clear days, I split a round or two of cedar and stacked it by size. On wet days, I checked fence wire along the back edge where elk crossed and pressed it flat. I kept the radio off. I kept my phone charging by the sink, volume up for the clinic and no one else. Grief had changed shape by then. It no longer knocked me down. It sat in me like cold iron and stayed. At work, I was steady. I washed a man's face after he coughed through the night and changed his gown before his daughter arrived. I held a woman's hand while she slept through morphine drift and counted her breaths by habit. I labelled syringes. I signed charts. I said what needed saying, and no more. Nobody at the clinic asked how my mornings were on the mountain. Rural people know when silence is a form of respect. By the second week of January, I started checking the road shoulder at mile 12 every morning before I turned toward home. That marker sat near a narrow pullout with a broken guardrail bolt and a shallow ditch below. The snow there crusted hard by midnight and took tracks clean. One dawn, I found prints in the frost bigger than any boot I had seen. 5 toes splayed, deep heel, long stride cutting from timber to ditch and back again. Not bare, not human. Too deliberate for random crossing. I crouched with my gloved hand near one print without touching it. Scout stood behind me, tail low, not growling. I took a photo on my old phone, then another with my hand beside it for scale. The camera timestamp glowed in the corner. Physical proof felt strange in my pocket. I could have texted it to the county deputy I knew from church suppers years ago. I could have taken it to the clinic break room and listened to jokes over stale muffins. I did neither. I drove home and copied the images to a folder on my laptop labelled Road Notes, then wrote the date in a paper notebook I kept by the stove. 3 mornings later, I found elk bones missing from the pullout, where winter carrion usually sat untouched for days. Clean sight, disturbed snow. No drag marks I could follow in the dark. I noted that too. The next day there was a snapped alder branch at shoulder height, fresh break, sap still wet. I wrote that down and kept my routine. The sign that settled it came at first light after sleet. I walked out to the truck with my lunch tin and stopped beside the hood. Someone, or something, had laid 2 cedar twigs in a clean X at the center line above the grill, each cut to near equal length, each aligned careful as if placed by hand, not dropped from above. Placed. I stood there while my breath rose and vanished, and Scout sat at my boots looking at the truck, then at the trees, calm and alert. I picked up the twigs and turned them over in my palm, fresh cut ends. No chew marks, no dirt. "Seen," I said, quiet, not sure whether I spoke to Scout or the woods. I put the twigs on the porch rail and left for shift. That night I drove slower than usual through the first switchback, then held steady toward Deadfall. Scout's head came up before mile 8. His growl started and stopped, then started again, softer this time. On my left, beyond the ditch, a dark shape moved between the fir trunks in even strides, keeping to the edge of the lights and never crossing toward the road. The shoulders were broad. The head rode slightly forward. The movement was smooth and quiet for something that size. I did not hit the brakes. I did not reach for the rifle behind the seat. I kept both hands on the wheel and matched the speed limit down to mile 12, and the shape matched me through the trees until the marker passed and the road bent east. Then it was gone, and the woods were only woods again. When I reached my cabin, dawn had come pale and thin. I sat in the truck after the engine died, listening to metal tick as it cooled. Scout rested his chin on my forearm. I thought of Eli's tape knots on survey stakes, his careful hands, the way he never wasted motion in rough weather. I thought of the cedar X on my hood and the stride beside my headlights. By then, I understood one thing clearly. Whatever walked that road with me was not chasing me away. It was keeping pace. I sat there another minute with Scout's weight on my arm and the windshield clouding at the edges. Then I took the lunch tin, the thermos, and my chart bag and walked up to the porch. The chain hooks clicked in the wind when I opened the door. Inside, the cabin held last night's heat, wood smoke, damp wool, and that faint, clean smell of pine boards warmed and cooled too many years. Scout went straight to his mat by the stove and turned once before lying down. I set the kettle on, hung my scrub top by the fire, and stood at the sink watching first light slide over the back slope. That was how most mornings ended. Boots by the door, keys on the nail, rifle still in its rack, unless weather said otherwise. I ate the same way too, because sameness kept the day from spilling. Soup in cast iron, 2 slices of bread, 1 hard apple if I had one. Then I checked Scout's water, latched the back shed, and walked the short fence run behind the cabin where elk crossed after dark. The wire did not keep them out. It only marked where my ground ended and timber began. When I came back in, I opened the notebook beside the stove and wrote what I had seen. Date, road conditions, marker. Movement left side parallel, no approach. I did not add guesses. In the army, I learned that bad notes got people hurt. In hospice, bad notes caused different harm, slower, but no less real. So I wrote plain facts, tore a dry corner off an old envelope to mark the page, and closed the cover. Sleep came in pieces that day. I woke once to the ping of thaw water hitting the metal bucket on the porch. I woke again to Scout's nails ticking over the floorboards as he changed spots in the light. Near noon, I gave up on more rest and split cedar rounds behind the shed until my shoulders burned clean. Eli used to say wood split better if you did not argue with the grain. He was right about that and most things that mattered. I could still picture him in a rain shell with survey tape in his teeth, grinning at weather like it was a challenge made for him. By evening, I shaved, pulled on fresh scrubs, and headed back down. The clinic lights always looked too bright after the tree line, square and steady against the dark. Inside, nothing changed fast. That was the work. I checked Mrs. Delgado's oxygen mask seal, adjusted Mr. Hale's pillows to ease the pressure on his right hip, and warmed broth for a man who could no longer hold a spoon without both hands. There were nights when I felt useful, and nights when I only felt present. Both counted. Mara met me at the medcart around 10 with 2 paper cups of coffee and a stack of insulin logs. Stormline moved north, she said. Road crew says slush above deadfall. I will run chains if needed, I said. She studied my face for a second, then looked down at the logs. You sleeping any better? Some. She nodded like she knew that meant no, then pointed to room 4. His daughter is early. She asked for you. I went in, kept my voice low, showed her how to wet his lips with a sponge swab, and wait between breaths. She thanked me with her eyes more than her words. Around 3 in the morning, the hall settled into monitor lights and soft shoes. At 5:30, I signed off charting and put on my jacket. The familiar rhythm held. I could trust my hands even when I could not trust much else. The road home was clearer that morning. Scout did not growl until just before the first switchback. Then he lifted his head and made that same low sound, chest deep and steady. I watched the right shoulder. Nothing. I watched the left. Tree trunks, snow crust, one flash of a rabbit tail. At mile 10, I saw a sway in the alder patch, too heavy for wind, then stillness again. I drove on and did not press the pedal. 3 days passed like that, work and road and cabin in their same order. By the 4th morning, routine no longer felt sealed. Small things kept turning up at the edge of it. I found tracks first, just below mile 12, where meltwater crossed and refroze. Not one set. 2 passes over each other, same long heel, same spread toes, one deeper as if carrying weight. I parked in the pull-out, set the hazards on, and measured with a folded ruler from my trauma bag. 14.5 inches from heel to toe, tip on the clearer print. I photographed both with the marker post in frame and the ruler beside them, then backed the truck out without stepping through the center. At the cabin that morning, the back fence wire had been twisted at one post into a clean loop and untwisted again. Not broken, not bent random by elk. The mud below it held no full track, only partial presses where something heavy had shifted. Scout stood by my knee and sniffed once, then looked upslope and stayed still. He did not bristle, he did not bark. I cooked eggs and wrote notes while they cooled. I cleaned my shears with alcohol pads, refilled saline syringes in the field kit, replaced one roll of gauze I had used the week before on a hiker who had split his palm on shale. Practical tasks settled me. Grief had no sharp edge anymore, but it had mass. It sat where breath should have gone easy. On tired days, it felt like carrying wet sand in my chest from room to room. The next shift ran hard. One patient coded and did not come back. Another drifted in and out and called me by his son's name until dawn. At changeover, Mara touched my sleeve near the sink. "You all right to drive?" she said. "Yes." "Take the lower route if it ices." "I know." I meant it as thanks, though it came out flat. She gave a short nod and let me go. Sleet started halfway up the mountain, tapping the windshield with a dry sound like handfuls of seed. Scout leaned forward between the seats and watched the left shoulder. Near mile 9, something moved in the trees at my speed, then dropped back, then matched again. I caught only shape and rhythm. Broad through the chest, head low, no sound over the sleet and engine. At mile 11, it slipped upslope and vanished behind fir. I did not stop until my own driveway. That afternoon, while the weather held grey and tight, I checked the road folder on my laptop and copied every photo to a second flash drive. I labelled one envelope Prince_M12 and one signs_cabin and slid them into the tin box with Eli's old survey maps. I was not building a case for anyone. I just wanted a clean line of record in case memory got slippery later. I had seen enough families argue over details at bedsides to know how quickly truth frayed when fear got near it. By the second week of February, the woods changed around the road in ways that had nothing to do with snow depth. Ravens stopped scavenging at the pull-out where elk remains usually drew them by noon. Coyotes called lower on the ridge and then cut off all at once, mid-pattern, like a door shut. Once, on a windless morning, I found a young alder bowed down over the ditch, with bark peeled in long strips from shoulder height to above my reach. The strips were laid side by side on a stump, not scattered. Ordered, deliberate. I stood there with my gloves in my pocket and felt that same pressure at the edge of thought. Not threat, attention. The morning after that, Scout refused to jump out when I parked at home. He stayed on the seat and looked through the windshield toward the timber, ears forward, body quiet. I waited with him. After maybe a minute, he licked his nose, sighed once, and climbed down on his own. He went straight to the porch, no backward glance. That was new. Scout did not spook easy, and he did not waste caution. Inside, I set my kit on the table and checked stock again. 2 trauma dressings, 3 saline bags, 1 elastic wrap, 1 pair bolt cutters under the rear seat where I kept tow gear. I told myself I was only organizing for winter roads. That was true enough to write down. Late that night, near end of shift, I stepped out the clinic's back door for air. Snowmelt dripped from the roof edge in slow ticks. The valley below was black except for 2 porch lights and the red blink on the radio tower. I thought of Eli then, not of the crash, but of a summer day before either of us had grey in our beards, when he had shown me how to read fresh slide scars above a creek crossing. He had laughed when I got it wrong, and then handed me the map pencil anyway. "You see better when you stop trying to be right," he said. I had carried that line for years and used it on nobody. The drive up was quiet until deadfall. At mile 12, my headlights caught the pullout and the marker post, then something pale on the asphalt edge near the guardrail. I slowed, rolled down the window, and leaned out. It was a strip of cedar bark, clean and narrow, braided into 3 strands and tied once at the end in the same hitch Eli used on survey tape so it would not slip loose in rain. I parked and stepped out with the engine running. Cold hit through my scrub pants. Scout stayed in the truck, but did not make a sound. I picked up the braid and turned it in my hand under the headlights. Fresh. Damp. No tool marks, no twine, no human footprint anywhere near it in the crusted slush. From the trees uphill came one low knock, wood on wood, spaced and measured. Then silence settled back over the ditch and road. I stood there long enough for sleet to bead on my sleeves. Then I tucked the braid in my jacket pocket, got back behind the wheel, and drove the rest of the way home at the posted speed, checking both mirrors, though there was no one behind me. Scout rested his chin on the seat between us, calm now, as if whatever moved beyond the lights had made itself known for the night, and asked nothing more. At the cabin, I left the engine running a moment longer than usual, hands still on the wheel, cedar braid warm in my pocket from my palm. Scout watched the tree line while the porch light threw a weak circle over the packed snow. Nothing moved out there. The woods held their shape and gave me no answer. Inside, I hung my wet jacket by the stove and set the braid on the table beside Eli's old map pencil. Up close, the hitch was clean and tight, tucked the same way he had taught me when we were young, and working summer survey jobs for cash. He used to laugh when I tied knots too fast and made them sloppy. This one had no slop in it. I wrote it down before I ate. Cedar bark braid, 3-strand, single hitch, found asphalt edge mile 12 near guardrail, no human tracks observed. One low knock from uphill timber after recovery of item. Scout quiet. I added the time from the dashboard clock and closed the notebook. Sleep did not settle easy that day. Rain came before noon and turned to freezing drizzle by afternoon, tapping the tin roof in a thin, steady rhythm. I lay awake listening to it and thinking of distances. Mile 8 to mile 12 was not far in daylight. At 4:30 in the morning, with sleet and black trees, it felt longer than maps said. By the next night, the storm had thickened. At shift change, Mara met me by the medroom sink with a folded county notice in her hand. "Upper road has standing water at deadfall," she said. "Drainage is backing up again." "I will watch it," I said. She looked toward the window where sleet ran in slanted lines against the glass. "Take your time going up. I always do. That was all. She touched my shoulder once and went to room 6. The night itself was hard and ordinary. A man with end-stage lung disease fought each breath until close to dawn, then finally drifted into a slower rhythm after I adjusted his medications and raised his bed. A woman in room 3 needed her linens changed twice, and only slept when I sat in the chair by her door, where she could see me each time she woke. Work gave my mind a rail to hold. When I stepped outside at 6, the parking lot had become a sheet of dark gloss under a skin of sleet. I put Scout in the truck, checked chains and started up the mountain in low gear. Wipers clicked hard. Headlights caught wet trunks and road spray, then swallowed the rest in black. Scout did not make a sound for the first few miles. Just past the first switchback, he lifted his head and braced his front paws against the seat. A low vibration started in his chest. Not warning bark, recognition. My grip tightened on the wheel without me telling it to. At mile 9, the left side timber opened for a short stretch, where old logging had thinned the lower Alder. I saw movement there at the edge of the beams, high and deliberate, pacing my speed. I told myself it was slope and shadow and branch swing in sleet. Then the shape stepped into a thin lane between trunks and held there long enough for doubt to drop away. Broad shoulders under dark, matted hair. Arms long, swinging low but controlled. Head carried forward, chin tucked slightly, as if cutting weather. Sleet silvered its back and crown. It did not run. It did not charge. It moved beside me in quiet strides with its body angled away from the road, turned just enough that I could see the line of cheek and one deep-set eye, catch the light and release it. For 2 breaths I froze exactly where I sat, both hands locked at 10 and 2, right foot hovering between brake and pedal. Fear came first in the body, cold and sharp under the ribs. Wonder came in behind it and settled heavier, like stepping into a church when no one else is there. I had worked trauma bays and field tents and deathbeds. I knew panic when it arrived. This was not panic. This was being seen. Scout's growl stopped. He stood rigid, ears forward, then lowered his muzzle to the dash and watched. The figure kept pace another 3 strides. At the next bend it reached a cluster of alder trunks, turned upslope without hurry, and disappeared into the rain-dark timber as if the forest had folded over it. I drove on, because there was no safe shoulder on that curve. My breath came shallow until mile 12, where the pull-out widened enough to stop. I set hazards, left the engine running, and stepped out into sleet that stung my face and soaked through scrub pants at the knees. The ditch below the guardrail ran fast with meltwater. On the muddy lip by the post I found one clear impression. Deep heel and long toe spread, already softening at the edges under rain. Beside it, a fir sapling bent toward the road. Not broken, held down by a length of peeled bark, looped once and tucked under itself. A knot again. Different hand, same patience. I did not touch the print. I photographed it with the marker post in frame and the ruler from my kit laid beside, then photographed the bark loop where it held the sapling down. Scout stayed in the truck, watching through the side window without whining. Back home, I stripped wet clothes by the door, fed Scout, and spread my notes and photos across the table, while the stove pushed heat into the room. The image of that eye in the headlight edge kept returning. Not wild, not vacant, aware. By the 3rd morning after that sighting, the storm line shifted east and left a brittle crust over everything from ditch grass to porch rail. I finished shift, drove up through thin fog, and pulled into the mile 12 turnout with a plan I had formed and reformed all night between med passes. I had packed 2 boiled eggs, 1 red apple and a strip of jerky wrapped in wax paper. Nothing salted heavy, nothing spiced, just plain food that would keep in cold. I stepped to a flat-topped stump just beyond the marker, where snow had melted off one side and refrozen hard. I laid the eggs side by side, apple above them, jerky below, making a simple triangle that looked intentional and left no question it had been placed. Then I backed away, got in the truck, and drove home without checking the mirror every second like a man afraid to blink. Scout looked back once through the rear window. He did not growl. I slept 4 hours and woke to pale sun on the floorboards. The first thing I checked was not the kettle. It was the clock. I had a half shift of daylight before I needed to leave for work, and the pull of that stump sat in me like a hand on my sleeve. I did not go. If I was going to do this, it had to stay consistent. Same time, same conditions, no chasing proof. At dawn the next morning, after another full night at hospice, I parked at mile 12 and walked straight to the stump. The food was gone. Not scattered. Gone clean. On the centre of the cut wood sat 3 stones stacked from largest to smallest, each one wet and dark, each balanced carefully. Tucked under the top stone was a short raven feather, stem pointed toward the road. I crouched and looked at the ground around it. One partial print in slush near the ditch. No boot tread, no tire mark except my own. "Thank you," I said, quiet enough that only Scout heard. He stood beside me with his tail level, eyes on the tree line, posture easy. That became a pattern. I left food after shift at the same stump, then drove on. I did not linger, and I did not call out. In return, signs appeared without noise or show. A split branch pinned an old grey feather so it would not blow. 2 sticks crossed on the guardrail cap with their cut ends aligned. A smooth riverstone set on my hood, one dawn directly above the latch, where I could not miss it before driving. 3 days passed, then 5. By the second week of March, snowline had pulled higher, and the ditch at Deadfall ran clear in the mornings. I kept my notebook up to date with dates and weather and items exchanged. I copied photos to the flash drive after each shift and returned the drive to Eli's map tin. Record mattered. It kept me honest. One evening before leaving for work, I stepped onto the porch to shake sleet water from my coat and found Scout already standing at the top step, nose lifted towards the back slope. The last light was thinning between fir trunks. At the edge of that dim band, maybe 60 yards from the cabin, something tall stood still. Not moving toward me, not hiding either. A dark shape against darker trees, shoulders unmistakable, head slightly inclined as if listening. I did not call out. I did not reach for the rifle by the door. I rested one hand on Scout's neck and kept my other hand open at my side, where it could be seen. We stayed like that for a long half-minute. Porch light behind us, damp earth and cedar in the air. Then the figure took one step back, then another, and faded between trunks without a branch, snap, or rush. Scout let out a slow breath and sat down. On the drive after that shift, I left 2 eggs and half a loaf heel wrapped in wax paper. In return, I found the next morning a narrow strip of fresh cedar bark, braided in 3 strands, and laid across my medical shears where I had set them on the stump while adjusting my glove. Not on the wood, by chance. Across the steel handles, centered, I stood there with cold seeping through my boots and felt, for the first time in years, that steady emptiness in me give ground by a small, measured inch. From then on, through rain and thaw and the last hard frosts, I kept to the same practice. Work all night, mountain road at dawn, food left plain and clean at mile 12. Signs returned in order and care. At the edge of my headlights, something moved beside me through the trees, never crossing the ditch, never pressing closer than it had chosen. and I learned to hold that pace without asking for more. The night after that exchange at the stump, the pace held at the tree line again, steady and deliberate from mile 9 to mile 12. It stayed that way as Thor worked at the shoulders and Runoff began to talk louder in the ditches. By the third week of March, Thor had eaten through most of the snowpack below the ridgeline, but cold still owned the hours before dawn. Rain came in hard after midnight and froze in places where the wind cut across the road. At shift end, Mara handed me my keys from the hook by the back door and looked at the sleet shining under the lot lights. "Deadfall is backing up again," she said. "Dispatch called around 4, water running over the shoulder." "I will take it slow," I said. She held my eyes a second longer than usual. "Text when you make it in." "I will." That was the only promise I made. Scout climbed into the truck stiff but steady, turned once on his blanket and faced forward. I checked chains, left them off for traction feel, and pulled onto the mountain road in low gear. Wipers beat a tight rhythm. The heater pushed warm air at my knees and did little for the windshield edges, which kept filming over with a grey skin of fog. At mile 7, Scout's head came up. At mile 8, he gave one low growl and then stopped. At mile 9, where I usually caught movement to my left, there was nothing but wet trunks and runoff shining in narrow lines. No stride in the timber, no matched pace. Just rain and engine and that thin, hard rattle of sleet against the hood. The absence sat wrong in the cab. I kept my speed at 22 and watched both shoulders. Near the second switchback, a branch cracked somewhere downhill, heavy wood under strain. Then silence. I rounded the bend and saw what County had warned about. Water was overtopping the ditch on the right and sliding under the guardrail in a narrow sheet. Not deep on the lane yet, but moving fast and black in the headlights. I drove another quarter mile and eased into the pullout by mile marker 12. The post leaned slightly now from frost heave. The stump where I left food was dark with rain, empty. No stones, no feather, no braid. I sat with the engine idling and listened to water move below the guardrail, louder than it should have been. Scout leaned toward the passenger door and stared down the slope. Then I heard it, not coyote, not elk. A thick, wet grunt cut short, followed by a choking pull of air. Scout stood up so fast his paws slid on the seat. He did not bark. He pressed his nose to the window and whined once, high and brief. The sound came again from below the rail, closer to the culvert mouth. Heavy breathing, a splash, another strangled grunt. I killed the engine and opened my door. Cold hit hard enough to sting my teeth. Rain and sleet mixed in my face. I stepped to the rail and aimed my flashlight down through salmonberry and alder stems bent flat by runoff. At first, I saw only water, fast and brown in the ditch channel. Then the beam caught an arm. Long, dark hair plastered to it, hand open against the mud, fingers wide, then clawing once for purchase. My light tracked right and found the body attached to it, smaller than the one that paced my truck, maybe shoulder high to me if standing, but now half submerged and twisted sideways in the chute. One leg was pinned low in the water, held by a steel cable loop cinched above the ankle. The cable ran to an old anchor point jammed under rocks at the bank edge, likely a poacher's snare left to rust and still alive enough to catch what stepped wrong. The juvenile's chest heaved above the waterline, then slipped lower as the runoff surged. It tried to lift, failed, and struck the mud with its shoulder. I froze with the light in one hand and my phone in the other. County dispatch was one tap away. Deputies, game wardens, lights, noise, people with long guns who would call this a public safety event and treat it like one. Maybe they would help fast. Maybe they would not get here before daylight. Maybe they would crowd the ditch and turn panic into injury. The juvenile coughed water and made that same trapped sound again. Choice did not feel dramatic. It felt narrow and practical. I knew trauma. I had tools in the truck. Water was rising. Delay had a cost I could hear in every breath it took. I put the phone back in my pocket. I moved quick then, the way muscle memory takes over when thought has already decided. I pulled the truck forward 10 yards and angled it crosswise to throw both headlights down through the rail gap toward the ditch. Hazards on. Parking brake hard. I popped the rear door, grabbed my trauma kit, bolt cutters, wool blanket, and a tow strap. Scout jumped down beside me. "Stay," I said. He held my eyes, chest vibrating low. "Stay at the rail." He went to the guardrail post and planted there, ears forward, body taut. I threaded one end of the tow strap around the base of the marker post and clipped the other end to my belt loop and jacket ring as a backup line in case the bank gave way. Not graceful, but enough to keep me from sliding straight into the channel if my feet went out. I tested tension once, then climbed over the rail and started down. Mud moved under me in sheets. Ice hid beneath it in clear plates that shifted when I weighted them. Alder stems slapped wet across my sleeves. Twice I dropped to one knee and slid a foot before catching myself on roots. The ditch noise got bigger with every yard. Up close, the juvenile looked younger than I thought from the road, not a little one, but not full grown. Its shoulders were broad yet narrow through the hips, hair thick but patchy with wet. The trapped leg was bent wrong under tension from the cable. Skin above the ankle showed a deep groove where wire had bitten through the outer hair and into flesh. Water hammered that spot with grit and cold. It bared its teeth when I came within 6 feet. Not in a lunge, just in pain and warning. Eyes wide, whites showing in the beam. Breath fast and ragged. I lowered my own body, kept my hands open and low, and let it see each movement. "Easy," I said. "I am here to help." Its chest hitched. One hand slapped at the mud, then gripped a root and held. I set the trauma kit on a rock shelf above waterline, clipped my flashlight to the rail of the kit so it washed the snare point, and slid the bolt cutters down beside my right knee. The cable was old aircraft steel, rusted in patches but still hard where tension pulled it straight. The lock-eye had tightened under every struggle. I could not cut near the limb without risking a strike. I needed slack first. I crawled upstream 1 yard and wedged a fist-size rock under the cable run where it crossed a root, lifting it enough to shift angle. The juvenile jerked and nearly rolled. I braced my left forearm across its upper back, not pressing, just steadying, and spoke again, low. "Hold still. Hold still." Rain ran down my neck and under my collar. My gloves were slick, grip failing on steel. I stripped the right glove off with my teeth and reset my hand bare on the cutter handle for feel. One jaw around cable near the anchor, one breath, then both arms down. The first squeeze dented strands and slipped. The second bite took 2 wires and snapped them with a dry pop. The juvenile thrashed once, water exploding around us. The remaining strands tightened. I shifted closer to the anchor and set the jaws again at a cleaner angle. Shoulders square, elbows locked, full weight down. The cable parted. Tension released so fast my hands slammed into mud. The free end snapped back and struck a rock. The juvenile tried to rise, failed, and sagged sideways into the flow. I dropped the cutters, got both arms under its chest and opposite shoulder, and heaved uphill toward the bank shelf where my kit sat. Weight and water fought me together. I dug my boots in and used the tow strap at my waist as a counterline, inching us out of the chute. Once its torso cleared the fastest current, it found purchase with one hand and helped, pulling weakly but enough. We reached the shelf, and collapsed against the mud wall, both breathing hard. I got to work. From the kit, I pulled a saline bag, tucked it inside my jacket for 1 minute to take the edge off the cold, then cut away matted hair around the wire groove with trauma shears. The wound was deep but clean enough to irrigate. No heavy pumping bleed. Good sign. I flushed with steady pressure until grit ran clear, then packed sterile gauze around the groove and held firm compression with both palms. The juvenile trembled under my hands, not growling now. Teeth unclenched. Breath still quick but less broken. Water from its coat soaked my sleeves through to skin. Above us on the road, Scout gave one low sound and fell quiet. I glanced up the slope. 10 yards uphill between 2 fir trunks stood the adult male I had seen in Sleet weeks earlier. Bigger at close range than distance ever showed. Shoulders like a split stump. Hair dark and roped with rain, silvered along the upper back. He stood still, arms low at his sides, head angled down toward the ditch. No charge posture, no bluff, watching. I looked back to the juvenile and kept pressure on the gauze. "Almost done," I said, though the words were more for my own hands than for either of them. When bleeding slowed to seep, I layered fresh pads and wrapped an elastic bandage from lower calf to above the groove. Snug enough for support, not so tight it cut circulation. To stabilize the leg, I cut a straight alder sapling thumb-thick and length of my forearm, padded it with folded gauze, and set it along the lateral side where the joint looked unstable. 2 wraps secured top and bottom. I checked distal warmth with my fingers. Cool, but present. The juvenile tried to pull the leg back and flinched. I held the splint in place and waited until the tremor eased. Next came heat. I shook open the wool blanket, draped it over shoulders and chest, then tucked edges under its sides to trap what warmth it still had. From my thermos, I poured black coffee into an empty saline sleeve and set it near the wrapped limb, capped tight to give off gentle heat through cloth without direct contact. Crude field trick, but I had used worse with less. Rain turned harder for a minute, drumming on the truck hood above us. Headlights cast white bars through branches and steam from our breath. My knees were numb in the mud. My lower back burned from the lift. None of it mattered while the juvenile's breathing kept slowing from panic to effort, from effort to rhythm. I rechecked the wrap once more. No fresh breakthrough. Splint holding. Chest rise more regular. Only then did I let myself look uphill again. The adult had not moved from his place among the firs. Water ran off his forearms in steady lines. His face was mostly shadow except for the eyes when the hazard lights pulsed red across wet bark. They were fixed on my hands, then on the bandage, then back to my face. I did not stand. I did not reach for anything. I sat back on my heels in the ditch mud and opened both palms where he could see them. For a long moment, nothing in the world moved, except rain, ditch water, and breath. Then the juvenile shifted under the blanket and leaned toward the slope, trying to gather its feet under it. I slid one arm behind its shoulders to keep it from rolling back into the channel, and held the splintered leg clear of rocks. It took weight badly the first attempt. Better on the second. On the third, with my shoulder braced to its side and one of its hands gripping a root above us, it came upright enough to stand trembling against the bank. I kept one hand on the splint and one on its back until the shaking settled to a fine quiver. "Steady," I said. Scout remained at the guardrail without a bark. I stayed there in the sleet with my hand on that wrapped leg and did not leave the ditch until the sky at the ridgeline began to grey. Grey light began to gather above the fir tops, thin as breath on glass, and I kept my hand steady against the splint while the juvenile found its balance. Its weight leaned into me for a second, heavy and shaking, then shifted toward the slope. Mud pulled at my boots. Water kept rushing past my knees and knocking bits of bark downstream. I eased my hand away from the wrap by inches, giving it space without abandoning it. The juvenile turned its head toward me, close enough now that I could see rainwater running in narrow tracks through the hair along its cheek and jaw. Its eyes were dark and clear at the same time, wide from pain but fixed on mine with a focus I had only seen in people who knew exactly what had been done for them. I did not speak for a moment. There was nothing useful to add. When I finally did, my voice came out low and plain. "You can stand. Keep weight light on that leg." The words were for me as much as for it, a way to keep my hands from trembling now that the hard part had passed. Uphill, the adult moved for the first time. He stepped down one pace from the fir trunks and stopped, still outside arm's reach, still carrying that same stillness that had followed my truck night after night. At this distance, he filled the slope, not from threat, from presence. Rain slicked his shoulders and ran off in steady threads. His chest rose slow, then slower. He looked first at the wrapped limb, then at the shears, the open trauma kit, the severed cable in the mud. Then he looked straight at me. I had stood under plenty of hard stares in my life. Drunk men in ER tents, panicked families in waiting rooms at 2 a.m, young soldiers who wanted to know if their friend was going to make it and could tell from my face before I said a word. This was not any of those. There was no demand in it, no challenge, no blank animal glare. Knowing was the only word my mind gave me, and even that was smaller than what sat in that moment. I lifted both hands slowly, palms out, reins striking the backs of my fingers. Then I set one hand against my own chest and gave a single nod. A simple motion, clear and deliberate. The adult's head dipped once in return. Not mimicry, not chance, response. Behind me, Scout let out a breath that sounded almost like a tired sigh. He stayed where I told him, chin near the top rail, ears forward but loose now. The juvenile shifted again and tested the splintered leg. It flinched and drew a sharp breath, then held. I crouched beside it and tightened the lower wrap a fraction where the elastic had slipped in the wet. "Easy," I said. "No rush." The adult took one more step down, just enough to stand beside the juvenile's shoulder. He did not touch me. He did not crowd. One long arm came across the younger one's upper back in a steadying hold that mirrored exactly what I had been doing. For a beat, we all stayed there in the runoff noise and sleet, each of us bracing the same injured body from a different side. I reached to my belt and unclipped the toe strap, careful not to startle them with the snap of metal. Then I coiled it and set it aside. I gathered the loose gauze wrappers and empty saline sleeve into the kit pocket out of old habit. Clean your scene. Leave less for trouble later. My fingers were stiff and pale from cold, but they remembered what to do. When I picked up the cut snare cable, the adult's gaze sharpened. He tracked the steel in my hand until I held it out where he could see the broken end and then lowered it to the mud beside the anchor rock. I pressed my boot heel down on it once, hard to flatten the loop. "Done," I said. He watched my mouth move, then the cable, then my face again. The sky lifted another shade toward morning. By the time the ridgeline turned from iron grey to dull silver, 2 more shapes appeared higher up among the trees. They came without sound, stepping between trunks and stopping in open view. Smaller than the adult near me, larger than the juvenile, both carrying the same broad-shouldered frame and long, easy balance. A family group, waiting. The juvenile made a low call in its throat, rough from strain. One of the newcomers answered with a softer tone that carried more vibration than volume. Scout's ears twitched, but he did not growl. I backed one step toward the ditch wall to clear their path. Mud slid under my right boot and I caught myself on a root. The adult shifted his stance at once, placing his body between me and the slip without advancing. Protection from both directions, all at once. Then he angled back toward the juvenile. They began moving uphill in short stages. The juvenile bore weight mostly on the good leg, using the adult's forearm and the bank roots to pull itself up. Twice it faltered. Twice they stopped and waited without pushing. I stayed where I was unless the splint snagged on brush, then reached in for one quick adjustment and stepped away again. At the rail, Scout made one small sound in his chest and looked from me to the slope. "I'm all right," I told him. He blinked rain from his lashes and held position. Halfway up the bank, the juvenile paused and turned its head back down toward me. Its chest was still heaving from effort, blanket dark with water, bandage already streaked with mud. It held that look for a long second, then tapped the wrapped leg once with the fingers of its free hand, as if marking the place where help had entered its world. After that, it turned uphill and kept climbing. The adult remained below the others for a few moments longer, near the fur where I had first seen him standing watch. He looked down at me again. I could feel the weight of that look in my sternum. Same place grief had sat for years like cold iron. I straightened as much as the slope allowed and gave him another nod. He lowered his head once more, then stepped back into line behind the juvenile and moved with them into the trees. I stayed in the ditch until the last shape passed between the trunks and thinned into rain and bark and distance. The woods took their outlines and held the silence after. Only then did my knees start to shake. I climbed to the rail slow, one hand on wet metal, one hand on alder stems. Scout met me at the top and pressed his shoulder against my thigh before stepping back to let me over. My gloves were gone somewhere below. My bare right hand was raw and numb. I leaned against the truck fender with my head down and listened to my own breathing until it settled. On the asphalt near my front tire, just beside the open trauma kit, lay my medical shears where I had dropped them. Next to them sat two short cedar sticks, cut clean and crossed in an exact X. I had not placed them there. Rain beaded on the fresh cut ends. No bark rot, no debris. Set with care in the narrow strip of dry ground the hood had sheltered. I crouched, touched the sticks with 2 fingers, then left them where they were. The mountain had gone quiet again, but not empty. I packed in order because order was the rail I knew. Used wraps in one pocket, cutter and spare gauze in another, thermos back in the cup holder. The severed snare cable went into a heavy trash bag from behind the seat, then into a plastic tote so it would not stain the cab. I took photos before moving anything. Cable at anchor point, cut strands, waterline at the ditch, the crossed sticks by the shears. Time stamps clear. From the driver's seat, I sent Mara a text with wet thumbs that missed 2 letters before I fixed them. Made it out late. I am safe. Deadfall ditch overflow is bad. Her reply came before I turned the key. Copy. Thank you. Rest when you get in. I started the truck, let the defroster clear a fist-sized patch, and called County Road Dispatch on speaker while I idled at the pullout. The woman who answered sounded tired in the way dawn voices do. I gave marker, condition, and the illegal cable snare location in plain terms. "Can you remove it this morning?" I asked. "We can send crew after first light," she said. "You are saying it is active hazard near roadway." "Yes," I said. "Water over shoulder and steel cable in drainage. Someone can get hurt. We will log priority." I gave my name and number. She read them back. Then the line clicked off. I sat another minute with wipers thudding and watched rain slacken to a finer mist. The first real daylight touched the upper branches. Scout curled down on his blanket, finally letting his eyes close. I drove home at 15 miles an hour, both hands steady on the wheel. At the cabin, I stripped wet gear by the stove and set the Cedar X on the table beside Eli's map pencil and the braided bark I had kept dry in a jar. Scout drank, ate, and went straight to his mat without checking the windows. Calm all the way through. I rinsed mud from my forearms at the sink and watched brown water spiral down the drain. My reflection in the glass over the faucet looked older than it had the day before, lines cut deeper around the eyes, beard rough with sleet and ditch grit. But something behind that face had shifted. Not healed clean, not fixed neat. Shifted. Before sleep, I opened the notebook and wrote every detail while memory was still warm. Time, weather, injury, treatment, response. Adult present throughout. 2 additional figures at first light. Crossed cedar sticks placed beside shears after withdrawal. I paused with the pen over the page. Then I added one more line. Eli would have understood this without needing it explained. By noon, the rain had broken. A county truck climbed past my place toward deadfall, with a culvert trailer rattling behind it. I stood on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and watched it disappear through the trees. Environmental trouble handled the way mountain trouble always had to be handled, by men with tools and time and cold hands. I slept for 3 hours, woke to weak sun on the floorboards, and stepped outside with Scout before leaving for shift. At the edge of the yard where elk usually crossed, the mud held one broad print angled toward the timber, deep heel, long toe spread, already softening at the edges as the ground dried. No second print near it, no circling. Just one mark, placed where I would see it when I came out the door. I looked at it, then at the dark line of fur beyond the fence wire. "Travel safe," I said. That night, driving home under a clearing sky, I reached mile 9 and saw a tall shadow move between trunks at the edge of my lights, matching my speed as if the old rhythm had never broken. Scout lifted his head, watched, and lay it back down without a sound. I drove the rest of that morning at a crawl, and the shadow kept to the trees until the last bend before my driveway. When I stopped by the porch, it was gone. Scout climbed down, stretched, and walked to the door without looking back. Inside, I set the kettle on and spread a towel under the plastic tote that held the severed cable. Mud water ran off it in thin brown lines. I took the tote to the sink, rinsed the outside clean, and left the cable bag sealed. Then I opened the notebook and wrote one more entry under the dawn rescue details. Escort resumed at mile 9. No approach. Scout calm. I slept hard for 2 hours and woke to the phone ringing on the table. "Mr. Thornton, this is County Road Dispatch returning your hazard report," the woman said. Same tired voice as dawn, clearer now. Crew cleared the drainage at Deadfall Bend. Culvert mouth was blocked by debris and old steel. Shoulder is open. We also logged your illegal snare location for enforcement pickup. "I still have the cut cable section," I said, "bagged in my truck. Can you drop it at the Skycomish substation before Friday?" "Yes." She read back my name and number again, then added, "Thank you for calling it in when you did. Water was climbing fast there." After I hung up, I stood at the window with the phone in my hand and watched meltwater drip from the eaves. The road trouble had an ending. That mattered. That night at shift change, Mara met me by the medcart and held my gaze the same way she had at the door in sleet. "Dispatch called the clinic," she said. "They wanted to confirm timeline from your report." "I gave them marker and conditions," she nodded. "They said your call kept that ditch from taking a car." I signed 2 insulin lines and capped my pen. Road was bad. She waited a second, as if there was another question she could ask. Then she shook her head once. "You look worn thin. Eat before charting." "I will." She never asked what else had been in that ditch. Not that night, not later. Her look said she knew there was more to my silence than fatigue, and she left it where it stood. 3 days later, on a clear morning with the Thor line pushed uphill, I drove to the substation with the cable in the tote and Scout in the passenger seat. A county foreman named Jory met me by the roll-up door, clipboard under one arm. "You the nurse who called Deadfall?" he asked. "Yes." He took the bag, looked at the rusted loop and cut strands, and gave a low whistle. "Mean piece of work. We found the anchor rock where you marked it. Warden took photos." "Any more out there?" I asked. "Not on that stretch now. We walked both sides from mile 11 to 13. He signed my hand receipt and tore off the carbon copy. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket with my keys. Physical hazard reported, removed, documented. Another line closed. When I got home, I sat at the table and dealt with the rest the same way I dealt with meds and chart corrections. One item at a time. I copied every road image from my phone to the laptop, and then to 2 flash drives. One drive went back into Eli's map tin. The second went into a mason jar in the pantry behind dry beans and rice. I printed 4 photos for county records. Flooded shoulder, snare anchor, cut cable strands, waterline in the ditch. I did not print the clear stride beside my ruler. I did not print the eye at the edge of sleet. I wrote that choice down in the notebook so I would not rewrite it later in my own head. Creature evidence retained private by intent. Not submitted, not denied. Kept. From the porch rail, I took the 2 cedar twigs from the first Hood X, now dry and light as paper. From the shelf, I took the crossed sticks from the ditch morning, the braided bark strip with Eli's hitch, and the receipt copy from county. I wrapped the cedar pieces in clean cloth and placed them in Eli's tin with his map pencil, and folded survey sketches. The tin went under the bed, same place it had sat for years. But now it held more than old paper. By the second week of April, rain had warmed, and the road shoulders showed green under the firs. I worked my nights, drove my route, and stopped at mile 12 at dawn with plain food in wax paper. I did not leave it every single day, only when weather and shift let me pause without rushing. Each time I stepped back to the truck and waited 10 breaths before pulling out. Each time I came through the next morning, something answered. A stack of 2 smooth stones on the stump after I left apple slices. A fresh cedar shaving braided once and tucked under the marker bolt after I left eggs. 1 raven feather pinned under a split branch with a stem aimed toward the road after I left jerky. No random scatter, no clawed mess. Ordered signs, set where they could be seen and read. I stopped trying to force names on it. Exchange was enough. On a dry night in early May, Mara found me rinsing a syringe tray and set a paper sack on the counter. "Soup," she said. "You keep skipping meal break." "Thank you." She leaned against the sink and looked at my forearms, where the last scratches from alder and ditch rock were fading yellow. "Deadfall bother you less now?" she asked. I dried my hands. "Road feels different." She nodded once. "Good." That was all, practical words, full meaning. In June, after a short shift and a clear dawn, I pulled into mile 12 and found no gift on the stump, no feather, no stone. The guardrail was dry. Ditch water ran low and bright over clean gravel where county had reset the channel. I stood there with Scout at my boots and listened to jays in the upper firs. For a moment I wondered if the pattern had ended and if ending was part of it. Then Scout turned his head toward the left timber and sat down, calm as sleep. I looked where he looked and caught movement 50 yards in. one dark shoulder passing between trunks at walking pace, angled away from the road, not leaving in haste, just continuing. I touched the marker post once with my palm and drove on. By the last week of August, dusk came earlier again in the cuts between ridges. My schedule had not changed. 6 p.m. clock in, dawn drive, cabin stove, notes, sleep, repeat. The difference was not in the work. It was in the empty spaces around it. They no longer rang hollow. On my first night off in months, I carried a thermos and 2 folding chairs to mile 12 before sunset and parked in the pullout with the engine off. Scout settled by my left boot and watched the trees. I sat in the chair facing the timber while light thinned from gold to grey across the asphalt. No traffic passed for 20 minutes. Then, one logging truck growled around the bend, driver lifting 2 fingers from the wheel as he went by. Dust settled. Quiet returned. At the edge of the fir line across the ditch, a figure stepped into view and stopped between 2 trunks. Tall, broad through the shoulders. Dark hair with silver at the crown where evening caught it. Arms low. Head inclined a fraction toward the road. I stayed seated, hands open on my knees. Scout did not growl. He put his chin on my boot and kept it there. We watched each other while the light drained out of the cut and the first cool came down from the upper slope. No signal, no motion to close distance. Just presence held steady on both sides of the ditch that had almost taken one life and had given another back. When the last line of sun left the road surface, the figure stepped backward into the fir shadows and disappeared. I sat a little longer until the trees were one dark wall and the marker post turned pale in my headlights. Then I folded the chairs, poured the last of the coffee onto the gravel, and drove home with Scout breathing slow beside me, alone in the cab and no longer living inside an empty world.